Great, thank you. You can all hear me? Yeah. Also, thank you to the speaker before me. He perfectly prepared the stage. It's about attention. And today at Republica, I want to talk about my own research, about a topic which I've been researching for a while, which is how collective attention and the power of platforms is interconnected with the growth of populism all over the world. But I also want to show how we can get back control over our attention, talk about how our research can help to develop solutions and alternatives to get out of this. I'm afraid that's not an easy task, and it's a task for several generations, which will keep us busy X, Y, Z, and beyond for a while. So let's start. I want to convince you today that we need to consider digitalization as a systemic change. What I mean by that is we need to understand that the micro-scaled changes in our everyday life, the news feeds we look at, the followers we have, the apps we use, that all of those are connected with the macroscopic layer, how public opinion is formed, who gets voted for, and also geopolitics. And that attention, this connection, works through our attention. And that's why the most important lever lies there, as we already heard. That happens in social networks. Social networks are complex, coupled systems. That's my specialty in physics. Those are systems in which individuals interact. The individuals, in this case, are us. We interact in social networks, and that creates dynamics which go from small changes in the micro level all through big changes on the macro level. That's the more important trait of these systems. But these systems also have another trait. They can experience tipping points. The small changes on the micro level can trigger a state change of the large system, and we enter states in which it's very hard to get out of. I'm afraid we are in such a state currently, but we can get out of it. Because if we, as a society, as a macroscopic system, understand that the solution where the problems come from is going back to the micro level and get back control over our attention. And I want to convince you of that with empirical proof how that solution works. Let's start something very microscopic, something personal. I always ask that, how often do you check your smartphone? You can check that with your pickups. I'm going to show something really intimate here. I seem to do this quite often, 150 times per day. I think that's a lot. I'm not doing many things that often every day. I'm not sure if somebody has a higher number, but I'm not the only one, I think. If you look at society as a whole, at humankind, what they're doing with information, there is a trend. This is the data which humanity copies, sends, saves in zettabytes, which are gigantic amounts. And you can see in the last 20 years, there's a rise. It might even be a somewhat exponential rise that we can observe here. In the talk before, we already heard what that could lead to. We have a gigantic amount of information, but our attention is bound to our brains. We all know we cannot process an infinite number of information at a time. We need to focus on one or two things. More isn't possible, and that is our attention. We need to pay our attention for any particular information, and that's why there is a problem of scarcity for our attention. I don't need to introduce this guy. That's Herbert Simon, social scientist, economist from the 70s. And in the 70s, he already described and prophesied this situation. And I think he was right with his prediction, because we know from this so-called attention economy. I think you all heard of that. A real monetary economy has emerged. We know that the 4 most valuable companies in the world earn their money one way or another trading our attention. They sell our attention to advertisements, for instance, and they're unbelievably rich through that. All right. Now, in the 70s, Herbert Simon could not do that, but digitalization opened up opportunities for quantifying these societal changes, which are fascinating to me as a scientist. And we're asking, can we measure that? Can we measure that and quantify that change? And yes, we can. For instance, this is work from a few years ago. We looked at hashtags in Twitter. It was easy to use Twitter data. And we use this as an approximation for collective attention. That's the frequency of certain hashtags, how they're used over time in 2016. And if many people use a hashtag, then many people read it. And that's kind of an approximation to where our collective attention goes over time. And if you look at that over the course of several years, we did this between 2013 and 2016, we could observe a certain change, which is those hills of attention, those peaks, how interest rises and falls again, because it always does. They've changed in their shape. They got more steep. They're rising more steeply, but they're also falling more steeply. And that means the frequency of different topics rises in our society. We called this an acceleration. We didn't just measure that in Twitter. We also checked Google search. The interest for certain Google searches rises more steeply and falls more steeply. We looked at Reddit discussion. Also that is getting faster. We even went into the offline world, looked at the digitalized Google Books dataset. It goes back 100 years into the past. And we also see that authors are picking up topics more quickly and lose them more quickly. And if you look at how tickets for the movies are getting sold, even that is getting steeper. So that acceleration of collective attention is a phenomenon throughout society which we can quantify and which already started before the digital age. It's a broader development, but during the digitalization, it finds its crowning moment. We started in the microscopic. I think I have a problem with my cell phone. I look at it too often, probably many other people as well. The discourse accelerates. That happens. That's neutral, generally speaking. But the next question is, does that also change the content which we're looking at? Do certain types of content have advantages in this economy of attention? And yes, that is the case. As you can already guess, we looked at millions of headlines from China to the US and analyzed them, looking if there was more negative or positive language used. And there are clear trends. The number of negative headlines has increased in the last 20 years, and the number of positive headlines has gone down. Other colleagues look at how contents are spreading, and if the political opponent is defamed or made fun of, then you can see antagonistic content on social media spreads especially well and gathers particular amount of engagement. So content has certain preferences. That's not a surprise. If you look at psychological research from the 70s, then you can see that attention isn't neutral. We're paying attention more frequently to negative information, to emotional information, but also indicators of group belonging. That has an evolutionary reason. It's more important to pay attention to danger or a positive news. It's an instinct for survival. Emotion is important. So there's evolutionary reasons for that. But the technological systems, the attention economy is increasing this attention and exploit it for commercial gain. We're going out further and further to the macroscopic level. I'm trying to go out. Then are there political forces which profit from these types of content? And also, of course, here the answer is yes, there are certain actors. In Germany, we know who that is, usually populist parties, populist influencers, which can achieve the largest reach on social media. The AfD in Germany achieves that on most platforms. Unfortunately, it's changing a little bit, but it's not just a German phenomenon. Populist parties, actors all over the world are rather successful in social media, not the least Donald Trump. That's not a surprise. The definition of populism is splitting the in-group against an elite, the people against some sort of elite that is acting against their interest, the out-group, so the us against them content, negative content, that goes hand in hand with populism and the social media logic. Actually, algorithms do play a part. That's a technical element. But on the one hand, there is psychology, which isn't neutral. But on the other hand, the algorithms pick up those systems and amplify them further and further. If you're looking at, these are the colleagues that did that during our election. If you create an empty account on X that doesn't follow anyone, and then just look at the For You newsfeed, there is a higher proportion of populist content, a lot more than they're actually posting from the AfD or others. That means these algorithms learned how attention works and maximize this, and that helps populist actors.
And the last step towards the macroscopic layer, all of this is happening online now. Discussions got faster, it increased altogether, and populists profit. But does that change our behavior, our political behavior? Can we measure that? How we vote, if we go to protests, how we build up our opinions? And that kind of question is difficult to answer, because here we have to somehow combine the offline and online data. And we went through the trouble to look at thousands of articles that were measuring this connection somehow. And we found several dimensions of political behavior. And around 500 studies really showed that connection. And there really is a connection. So the studies agree on the dimensions that there's a connection between the usage of digital media and social media and political behavior. First, learning is a positive for democracy. So people on social media, they behave politically. They went more to protests. They vote more. They bring themselves into local politics and so on. But if we move on, if we go deeper, maybe also positive, people who are a lot on social media, they are better informed when it comes to political topics, but they trust democratic institutions or media a lot less. That's a development that we hadn't seen before we did this study, and I think it's interesting. I mean, trust is a thing. There is mistrust that is well placed, also in democratic institutions sometimes, but there's also misplaced mistrust. Also, lost trust can also help populists to push their narratives. If we look at the other side now, it's less good. populist opinions and narratives, this we are the pure folk, the pure people, and all those ideas, they also seem connected to social media, so it's stronger where people use social media more. They are more polarized as well, so effective polarization. You hate your political opponent more. That's also connected to the content, and hate speech is very common there as well. So it's not as simple as we think. There is different dimensions of political behavior. But all in all, I want to make clear that science found empirical connections between the usage of digital, social media and important democratic behaviors. And it does not look good for the liberal democracy, liberal in the European sense. And this is just a correlation, so we don't know about the causation yet. It could just be that more interested people are more active in social media. It could be that they get more interested on social media. We cannot tell yet, but it's part of our ongoing research to understand this better. I hope I could still convince you that there is a connection, that we can, from the macroscopic, how our newsfeeds work, how the likes work, how we use our phones, that it's measurable in its influence on our behavior on the macroscopic. I mentioned earlier the tipping points. You might know it from the climate research. They are those spaces where if you overcome a tipping point, you reach a new state that's difficult to escape. And sometimes I feel like a climate researcher because they look at the global temperatures and how they change. And we look at democratic indices. Here's one of the most established one, and we see it on a graph over the continents. And what we are interested in now is the last 10 years or 20 years, and it's going down fast. And we worry about it. And what I mean by tipping points is also those people. In the US, when Trump was re-elected, I think we witnessed such a tipping point because the power of those platforms became obvious. And a tipping point is then reached when effects become self-enforcing. And the power of Donald Trump is established and strengthened by the platforms. And it's difficult to escape, so I think we reached a tipping point. Another parallel to the climate research, that those tipping points become more and more with time, and it becomes more and more difficult to escape. So this is the CO2 budget we have, and we already know that to reach our goals right now, we would have to reduce the emissions so much that we would basically have to go to zero immediately. And with democracy, I think it's similar, unfortunately. If we acted more decisively in 2016 with the platforms and gained more control over our attention, it would have been easier. But now we are in 2025 and we already toppled some tipping points. And we lost the US as a partner to reach those goals. And I think we have a closing window of opportunity in Europe. The political climate is changing here as well. And who knows how much time we have left to really do democratically worthwhile politics for the... So yeah, I think urgency is real in this. But also there's solutions. And we want to work on real alternatives. And there still is a window of opportunity, maybe especially now, because the US shows so blatantly how crippled power can look. And I think our way there is with the attention back to the microscopic, because that's where the power of the platforms is. It's different from how we see power usually. Usually we see it as top-down. The government regulates society, and the media, they send their messages. But the platforms, they control our interactions. They control the microscopic, what we see every day on our newsfeed, who we can interact with, and that's where we have to attack. I'll show this picture again because it helps me at least to make obvious the levels we have. And I think there's certain trigger points we can use. Of course, there's more, but I think those are the ones we don't focus on enough. For example, there's platform design. When is what shown? How is the logic of the feed? Which social interaction are possible? Can we like? Can we comment? What's the surface? What's the UI of the platform? There's a lot of things we can change. The social interactions. So how are the groups built? Who is visible? Who can you interact with? We talked about the distortions of social media. How can we fix that? The individual control. We only have limited settings. We have a few settings, but we have little control over what we want to see. And of course, this leads us to the algorithms. And of course, we have to tackle the algorithms. We know little about them, but we know that in the back end, of course, they divert our attention, and they are really important for where our attention goes. And I want to show a few projects that work with evidence-based research. So the pro-social design network that I work with, and we want to show and push design that helps social interaction. So they try to limit hate speech in discussions, to make interactions more productive. And there's experiments, we collect research papers, and you can look at all of that on the website. And the idea is that people who want to build new platforms, alternative platforms, that they can use this as an archive, as a research opportunity. So maybe there's a thanks button, and there's research, does a thanks button help? Or that pro-social behavior is rewarded and made more visible. So I invite you to have a look. Then I worked on a study that tries to push individual control. Unfortunately, we have to use third-level apps because as of now, we don't have much control. And this app, OneSec, maybe some of you know it, it's quite popular. It's quite simple. It can be used to jump in if you open an app that you might not want to open. And it asks you, do you really want that? And there's a wait screen as well. And studies found that it actually helps. So people use this app that they want to use less, and they use it less then, and they are happy with it. So a third app can help regain control. The algorithms, it's a difficult topic because we have little information. They are more or less secret. People who work on this, me included, don't really know how those algorithms work. But we can develop hypothetical algorithms. We can do experiments where we compare algorithms, one that targets engagement, one that's more random, or another one that's bridging based. That's an idea that came up recently. It's one that tries to show me things that I don't really consider yet, but to broaden my worldview. And then we build platforms with different algorithms and check how the polarization changes. So those are smaller experiments, but we already see that the engagement maximizing ones are worst for polarization and increased polarization. And in the end, of course, there's the social interactions, the setup of groups. We already know that it's a big problem in social media debates that very few people produce most of the content. So the social discussion and discourse is not representative. And the question is, how can we correct that? How can we make this discourse more representative? So we started an experiment on Reddit and built our own subreddits and introduced different rules. in each of them. And in one, we encourage people who don't usually write comments to write them. And so this improved the discussion climate. They remained longer in discussions. And whenever something became toxic, just a very few stayed who apparently like it. And then the discourse is twisted again. And with these experiments, we can get closer and closer to possible alternatives. But you see, we need to do experiments on existing platforms, or we have to create hypothetical algorithms. And just the size of this task, we need systemic change. Probably our little experiments will not solve this. I think we need to do an effort as a whole society. And I think we can do this, especially in Europe. In science, we had big topics before. For example, CERN in particle physics is an example for inner European cooperation, but also in Potsdam, where a lot of work on climate research is happening. And for digitization, I think we need something similar. We need similar efforts. And if we see digitization as a real societal change, and not just a new media, not just social media, something that's over there, but real interconnectedness within the society, then we need to do real research that does justice to this challenge. And if we do this, then hopefully I could convince you that we can do it by as a macroscopic problem. We understand that we gain our power in the macroscopic and protect our democracy that way. And with that, I want to thank you all for your attention.